Hello and welcome to another episode of the World War II podcast. I'm Angus Wallace. In episode 64, I discussed the opening of the Guadalcanal-Solomons campaign with Jeffery Cox. Well, we left it hanging with the Americans in control of the airfield on Guadalcanal, but they had in no way secured the island. The US Navy had suffered a number of serious losses, including the carrier Hornet, and the Enterprise had been seriously damaged, forcing her to withdraw for repairs. Jeff has now finished his second book in the series, Blazing Star, Setting Sun, so I've got him back to talk about the end of the campaign on Guadalcanal. But before we get started, just to remind you, if you enjoy the podcast every few weeks, why not help me put the show together with a small recurring donation each month of $1 or so. It's easy to do via Patreon or PayPal, and you can find the details at patreon.com/WW2podcast or ww2podcast.com/donate. Those small donations help me find the time to do this show for you. And it's a surprising amount of time I have to put into researching, recording, editing, and then the website and social media. I do try to give something extra to supporters of the podcast by releasing exclusive bits that were left on the virtual cutting room floor, which I hope might be of interest. So that's patreon.com/WW2podcast or ww2podcast.com/donate to sign up via PayPal or Patreon. Jeff, welcome back. Do we need to remind ourselves why the fighting in and around the Solomons and Guadalcanal was important? Why was it contested territory?
What happened was, after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had decided to revert to a more conservative but still expansionist strategy for the war in the Pacific. And it was one that they had considered before Midway but had ultimately rejected, and they went back to it. They wanted to isolate Australia to prevent it from becoming a jumping off point, a staging area for an offensive against the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And so to isolate Australia, they were going to capture islands, build air bases to deny entry between Australia and the United States. And they had their primary South Pacific fortress at Rabaul on New Britain. It had the best harbor in the South Pacific, and they were building bases going down the Solomons. They decided, the Japanese, to build an air base on Guadalcanal. And Guadalcanal was, as one officer pointed out, it is right on the line from San Francisco to Townsville in Australia. So it would have had a blocking position, and we would have had to go around it. And the Japanese started building this air base not very quickly. The Allies had a group of what became known as coast watchers in the Solomon Islands. These were like former Australian officials or British officials or plantation owners who stayed behind in the islands, and their job was just to report on what they saw. One of them, Martin Clemens, reported that the Japanese were building an air base on Guadalcanal, and that air base was also sighted by our scout planes. And Admiral King, who was heading the U.S. Navy in Washington, he had wanted to find any way to strike back at the Japanese, a place to take the offensive. And he decided that, well, if they're building an air base on Guadalcanal, how about we capture the air base and use it ourselves, which is something the Japanese had done in the past in the Java Sea campaign. And it was a little bit tricky because we weren't quite ready to take the offensive just yet. We had to scrape a lot of things together very quickly. Normally, when you take the offensive, you get to choose the place and the timing of that attack. In this case, it was almost as if the Japanese had chosen when and where we attack, because the closer the airbase got to completion, we had to capture it before it was completed, before the airbase became operational. And it was set to become operational in August of 1942. It was maybe about a week away when we had the U.S. Marines land on Guadalcanal, and ultimately took the airbase. The airbase was guarded by what was called the Special Naval Landing Force, which sometimes are called Japanese Marines, but they're really naval infantry. They're just basically sailors on shore duty. We took the airbase rather quickly, but it got off to a bad start because the Japanese had launched several air attacks against our transports in the Solomons between Guadalcanal and Tulagi, which is another target of the invasion. These bombers kind of spooked the American carrier commander, who didn't want to invade in the first place. And so he decided to pull the carriers out, which meant all those transports and their escorts would have no air cover. This was an unfortunate bit of timing because the commander of the escorts had to go to a conference to deal with pulling out all the aircraft. And that's when the Japanese showed up in the form of Admiral Mikowa and a bunch of cruisers. And he promptly smacked the U.S. with the biggest defeat, the worst defeat of the U.S. Navy in history at the Battle of Savo Island. It was one of the first of the night battles in the Solomons, the night naval battles, and the Japanese were very good at this. And they just surprised our ships, who really had no commander at that point. The transports that were carrying our troops and all the supplies for them, they were helpless at that point. But the Japanese got spooked. Admiral Mikowa got spooked because he thought, well, I'm going to be heading back in the morning. Those aircraft carriers, I don't know where those American carriers are. They might find me. I better just speed back right now. So he left the transports safe and turned what was a massive Japanese tactical victory into what you might call an Allied strategic victory, because the transports had not been sunk. But they had to pull out, and they took all the Marine supplies with them. This was all new for the U.S., an amphibious invasion in the modern era. And we were doing what was called makey-learny. Try something, try anything, it might work. You learn by doing. We didn't have a book as to how to put this stuff together necessarily. Combat loading, for instance. And so the unloading of the transports, their supplies on the beach had been chaotic. We didn't get a whole lot of the stuff out. And so when we pulled out, the Marines were left, the 1st Marine Division was left high and dry. In fact, one of the more cheeky members of the Marines, he called them the 1st Maroon Division, because they were left behind on Guadalcanal, didn't know when the carriers would come back, didn't know when their supplies would come back. They had to live on Japanese supplies for a long time, and they made the most of it. It was a very hostile environment, but they had maybe 2 weeks to get acclimated to that environment before the Japanese started launching a major counterattack to try to regain the airfield. So they were able to get used to it. And the Japanese began probably late that August. The Americans had landed the first week of August 1942. The Japanese had begun in late August trying to recapture the airfield, not very competently. When you see them on Guadalcanal, they just look completely inept. The Japanese ultimately made 3 land attempts to take back the airfield, and all of them failed. One of them came close to succeeding, but all of them failed, and the 2 of them were just miserable failures. But it also hits that Guadalcanal became something of a vortex that sucked in resources from both the Allies and the Japanese, because the Allies held the airfield and had to defend it, and the Japanese had to take it back. But no one really had the ability to deliver a knockout blow to the other one. We weren't strong enough at that point. The Japanese were strong enough, but they could not commit to it for whatever reason. The Japanese had this idea about the quote-unquote decisive battle, that the Pacific War would be decided by a decisive battle like Tsushima was in 1905 against the Navy of Tsarist Russia. and they thought the Pacific would be decided the same way. And Guadalcanal was not the decisive battle. They didn't quite know what the decisive battle looked like, but they were sure Guadalcanal wasn't it. The airfield gave the Americans and the Australians ultimately an advantage because Navy ships moving around the airfield were vulnerable to air attack during the daytime.
Well, what keeps coming back to me is you can always describe the airfield as the carrier that the Americans don't have that's unsinkable.
Yeah, it's an unsinkable carrier. But there is something else, though, that often gets lost in the equation, is that it's a dirt airfield. And the Japanese would come along at night and they'd bombard it with their ships, and they'd poke holes in the airfield, in the dirt airfield, and then we would fill up the holes with dirt because it's a dirt airfield within an hour, and the airfield will be operational again. I mean, if it's a dirt airfield, it's really hard to knock out. And they would eventually put Marston matting on it. And if the Marston matting was damaged, they would just replace the matting. That's how we got the first book of the trilogy, Morning Star, Midnight Sun, because when the morning came, the star on U.S. Marine and Navy aircraft was dominant. It dominated the skies around Guadalcanal, and if Japanese Navy ships came down during the day, they ran the risk of being sunk by air attack. But at night, we couldn't do it. We could not send the aircraft up at night, or when we did, it wasn't real successful. And so the Japanese would come up with what we eventually called the Tokyo Express, designed by Admiral Tanaka, where Japanese destroyers would dash in, land troops on Guadalcanal, bombard the airfield a bit, and then scooch back up the slot, the middle New Georgia Sound passage between the lines of islands and the Solomons, and be back up their base and out of American air range by daylight.
So that sounds nonsensical. So they're doing this sort of by the end of October. They're trying to run more and more troops in by destroyers. Why are they not using troop ships? Because surely you make the destroyer ineffective by stuffing it full of troops and supplies. Wouldn't they be better off trying to run something else in that's purpose built for carrying reinforcements?
Well, Japanese tried that, and it was to be covered by their main carriers, Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier striking force, in what became known as the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, at least known in Allied circles, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. And the Japanese sent troop ships down, and a bunch of them were sunk by air attacks from Henderson Field. And Tanaka decided at that point, because Tanaka was commanding those troop ships and those transports, he said, this isn't going to work. I need air cover to come here during the daytime. I can't do it. So let's come up with something else. And so he decided to have the destroyers run the troops in, land them, and then have them scooch back out. So they wouldn't have to deal with American air power. And that's how you got the Midnight Sun portion of the Morning Star, Midnight Sun, because once midnight came around, it was the rising sun that was predominant. The control of the sea around Guadalcanal changed when the sun crossed the horizon. But you are absolutely correct that destroyers, they lose their effectiveness when they're packed with troops. But it's even worse. It's even worse than that. Destroyers are the biggest fuel hogs in the Navy because they are the fastest ships generally. And if they're going fast, which they had to be to go to Guadalcanal, drop off the troops, and then scooch back up, they're going to use more fuel as they go faster because of the resistance from the water. And they have small fuel tanks. So in any Navy, destroyers were always thirsty for bunker fuel. They were always thirsty. They were always needing refueled. In the case of the Japanese destroyers running to Guadalcanal and back with the Tokyo Express, the whole Japanese rationale for the war was to get oil. This was the original war for oil. They needed the oil of Indonesia. If you're using up all the oil running troops into the Solomons, that kind of defeats the purpose of a war. the other thing with the destroyers is they can run troops in, but they can't run in tanks. They can't run in heavy artillery. They can't run in a whole lot of supplies. And so what would happen is the Japanese would land these troops on Guadalcanal, but they could never quite reach the critical mass that was needed in order to take the airfield, because they couldn't run in the heavy artillery that they needed. They couldn't run in all the supplies that they needed. And the Japanese were also struggling with the jungle. Fighting in the jungle, going through the jungle is not easy. After what they did in Malaysia, heading down to Singapore, which was brilliant, what they did on Guadalcanal was comical. I mean, General Kawaguchi, he's supposed to launch an attack on the airfield at Guadalcanal. He's supposed to go south of the airfield to attack it. And he only has a hydrological map of the north coast of Guadalcanal that doesn't include the spot from which he's to attack the airfield. And yet he doesn't think to get a better map. He lands, leaves a guard for his supply cache at around Taivu Point, and then the 1st Marine Raider Battalion lands there and starts destroying the supplies and shooting at the Japanese guards, and the Japanese guards run to General Kawaguchi, who's in the jungle by this point, and say, Americans are shooting at us. What should we do? This happens all the time. Talk about lack of initiative. Then Kawaguchi gets to the place south of the airfield from which he wanted to launch the attack, and he discovers the hills there. And at that attack they had, the Japanese nearly took the airfield at that point, because the Marine commander, Alexander Vandegrift, he kind of misjudged the Japanese at that point. He didn't make too many misjudgments in the campaign, but he made a big one here, and it almost enabled the Japanese to take the airfield. But the Japanese had one unit that was supposed to take part in the attack, but didn't, because its general got lost in the jungle. And so it heard all this fighting going on, and it just sat there and did nothing. The Japanese probably came the closest to taking the airfield, Henderson Field, in mid-October after the bombardment by the Congo and Haruna, the battleship bombardment. That they called it the bombardment, or Devil's Night, or Hell's Night, or something to that effect, because it practically destroyed the American Air Force on Guadalcanal, that they called the Cactus Air Force, because Cactus was Guadalcanal's code name. It practically destroyed it because all the fuel caches were destroyed, and they were struggling to get any aircraft in the air without fuel, and with all the damaged aircraft around, they were literally cannibalizing planes just to get something in the air. And the Japanese had used that bombardment to land a couple transports full of troops and full of that heavy artillery. Even so, the Americans launched counterattacks from Henderson Field and managed to damage the transports. That's how dangerous Henderson Field was to ships around it. Those transports ended up being damaged, as weak as the Cactus Air Force was, because of the transports just sitting there, landing their troops, and we would drop bombs on them with just a few aircraft, but it was enough to scare the Japanese off. And then the troops the Japanese landed, they could not get through the jungle to attack the airfield soon enough. Once they were in position to attack, there was some office politics going on involving Colonel Masanobu Tsuji. He was friends with the prime minister. And so he had a lot of influence. He was called the God of Operations. And in fairness, he was very good at devising the Japanese plan to take Singapore. But he connived to get one of the commanders, General Kawaguchi, removed the night before the battle. And so the Japanese changed commanders immediately before the battle. And that was one reason they lost. That last attempt to take the airfield was because they had a new commander who didn't know what he was supposed to do, who had nothing to do with the plan. And so he was just sort of stuck wandering around the jungle. And this stuff goes on and on and on.
It does go on. But the Japanese, they're planning a push, aren't they, in sort of in mid-November. And the Americans, because they've, it's magic, isn't it? They've cracked the Japanese code. But Halsey has no carrier because the Enterprise is damaged, it's in for repair. You know, how can Halsey and the US Navy support the Marines on Guadalcanal? Has he got anything left to sort of throw in?
Well, by that point, that last Japanese attempt to take the airfield was supposed to be in conjunction with an expedition by Kido Butai, the Japanese Carrier Striking Force, or at least what was left of it after Midway, to come down and with the cover provided by the newly captured airfield, they were going to attack the American carriers and cut Guadalcanal off from the American bases to the east and to the south. And in fact, the Japanese army radioed that they had captured the airfield. And so Admiral Yamamoto sent the carriers down. And he sent scout planes down to figure out, to maybe land at the airfield and see what was going on there. When they were shot down by anti-aircraft guns at the airfield, he figured out that, well, maybe we don't have it. And then the Army had to signal, sorry, we didn't capture the airfield. We just captured a field.
One might have thought the lack of opposition would have been a giveaway.
On the American side, Admiral Halsey, as you mentioned, he had taken over in the middle of October 1942 because the previous commander, Admiral Gormley, he acted like he wasn't playing so much not to lose as playing as if he had already lost. He didn't want to launch the offensive at Guadalcanal. He was husbanding all of his resources in the assumption that Guadalcanal would be retaken by the Japanese. Thus, he would need to defend all these American bases in the rear areas and closer to New Zealand, New Caledonia. And that just wasn't going to get it done. He wasn't giving the Marines on Guadalcanal the support that they needed. And so it was becoming more of a war of attrition. And then the Enterprise was finally repaired at Pearl Harbor, and she was rushed back down to try to combat this effort by Kido Butai to support the Guadalcanal landings and to take out the American carriers. Admiral Halsey was in charge by then, but as we will find out much later in the war, Halsey had some communications issues. He was a good admiral, and he gave Guadalcanal all the support he could. He promised General Vandergrift, I'll give you everything I've got. And that would make the difference, ultimately. He sent the Enterprise up with the Hornet to try to ambush the Japanese carriers like they had done at Midway. But they weren't supposed to go too far north and leave themselves exposed. That part of the orders did not get through to the admiral in charge of the American carriers, Kincaid, and Halsey probably never sent it. And so the American carriers, they were exposed, and the Japanese found them. And the Japanese had not only Kido Butai's Shokaku and Zuikaku, but they had the light carrier Zuiho and the former cruise liner with the heart of an aircraft carrier, the Junya, which is a really weird ship. And so we were outnumbered. The Hornet took some punishment and was disabled. And the Japanese then found the Enterprise, and they bombed her. But they couldn't sink her. But they bombed her. The Hornet ended up being sunk. The Japanese took massive losses of their air crews at this battle, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands, because of the improved anti-aircraft capability of the Enterprise, which got some new Bofors anti-aircraft guns, and the battleship South Dakota, which they said shot up so much shrapnel she looked like a volcano. It was a tactical victory for the Japanese because they sank the Hornet. The destroyer Porter ended up being sunk by another one of those U.S. torpedoes that made a circular run. And the Japanese lost nothing. They had serious damage to the Shokaku, but she survived. They had some damage to the Zuiho, but she survived. They both had to go back to be fixed. But the air crews, the loss of the Japanese air crews was so bad that they could not take advantage of the opportunity afforded by having only one American carrier left in the Pacific, and she was damaged. She's leaking oil down by the bow. Her elevator would not work. That was the situation right after the Battle of Santa Cruz Islands. That was the nadir of Allied fortunes on Guadalcanal. The Japanese had the advantages in ships, they had advantages in carriers, but their pilots weren't any good anymore. We had one carrier left. She was badly damaged, but we had battle-tested, battle-experienced pilots and an unsinkable aircraft carrier in Guadalcanal. And it remained for the Japanese to try to figure out how to manage their remaining advantages in the South Pacific to retake the airfield. They were going to have another bombardment. This time it was going to be by the battleship escorts of Kido Butai, the Hiei and the Kirishima, both of whom had been on the Pearl Harbor Task Force. They were going to have a reprise of the October bombardment that nearly destroyed the Cactus Air Force. They're going to use the Type 3 shell, and they were going to use an escort of destroyers and the light cruiser Nagara to keep away any possible interference with the bombardment. The battleships bombarding the airfield would be cover for 11 transports of Japanese troops to land on Guadalcanal and finally put together the critical mass needed to overwhelm the defenders, the Marine defenders of Henderson Field.
Is this, are we looking at sort of, is this the 13th of November? Is this when this goes in? Am I at the right?
Yeah. It's supposed to be about in the middle of November. That was the plan.
Yeah, and this is when they're bumping into Admiral Turner's resupply mission, and he leaves, is it Admiral Callahan, to defend against possible attack.
They often say that the winner of any battle is the one who makes the fewer mistakes. That wasn't the case here, because we made so many mistakes setting up for that battle and during that battle. And some of them there wasn't a lot we could do. U.S. intelligence magic had determined that the Japanese were sending down this battleship force to guard these transports. What do we have to stop it? Well, we had two little forces of cruisers and destroyers that were escorting reinforcement convoys to Guadalcanal, one under Admiral Callahan and one under Admiral Scott. They were to combine and just block, as Admiral, I believe it was Morrison who said, block and block hard. These ships had never worked together for the most part. We were, at this point of the war, we had so few ships, we had to push them hard and just assemble whatever ships were on hand to send them out to the next mission. They didn't really have time to train together. They didn't really have time to get to know each other. We still were not experienced at night warfare. We had two admirals in this force, Admiral Scott and Admiral Callahan. Admiral Scott had commanded American forces previously at the Battle off Cape Esperance, which he fought a decent battle, and it was the first American naval victory in the Solomons campaign. He had studied hard, he had trained his troops, and the sailors had confidence in him. They loved Admiral Scott. So naturally, he was not chosen to command this force because Admiral Turner seems to have had this thing for seniority. And Admiral Callahan had 2 weeks more seniority than Admiral Scott. Admiral Callahan had been Admiral Gormley's chief of staff, where Admiral Morrison would say that he had escaped distinction as Gormley's chief of staff. He had been captain of the San Francisco, but the San Francisco had mostly been in port, being refitted during that time. He had been President Roosevelt's naval aide as well. He didn't have a lot of battle experience. So Callahan was put in charge, and he was put in a bad position, and he seems to have known it. I get the impression he did not want this command, that he knew he was lacking in the experience necessary for this, but he felt he couldn't turn it down. He didn't want to fight this battle because the San Francisco was a ship he knew and was named after his hometown, he chose to have his flagship the San Francisco. And the crew noticed the change in his mood from the time that he had been captain. He was more somber. He was less confident. He was more tense. And he was overheard arguing with the new captain of the San Francisco, Cassian Young. And Young was calling this suicide, and Callahan was understanding it, but saying we still had to fight it. But Callahan was trying to radio in that he thought this battle was suicide. The Japanese were coming down with 2 battleships. High-end Kirishima had 14-inch guns, and they had significant armor, not the normal armor, because they had started out their careers as battle cruisers. But they had been changed to battleships and fast battleships to operate with the carriers. And so they had more armor than most cruisers, certainly. The U.S. Navy decided in the 1930s to take the torpedoes off of its cruisers. So our heavy cruisers armed with 8-inch guns, they could no longer launch torpedoes at the enemy. We were the only Navy in the world to do that. The only cruisers that we had that had torpedoes were either made before the mid-1920s, the early 1930s, or they had been like the Atlanta class, were called anti-aircraft cruisers, but originally they were to be destroyer leaders. But the 8-inch cruisers, like the San Francisco, what Callahan was commanding, and the Portland, which would also be in this force, they did not have torpedoes. Their guns could not penetrate the armor of a battleship under normal circumstances. So if you put our cruisers against Japanese battleships, they were going to lose because they had no way to sink the battleship. They could damage its topsides with the 8-inch guns and the secondary armament, but they could not sink it. And this was where it really became a problem, because the San Francisco and the Portland really had no way to sink the Hiei and the Kirishima.
Yeah, but the other thing to remember about the Friday the 13th is you actually have to remember to fire. There's an 8-minute period where the U.S. Navy seems to fail to fire on the Japanese.
Yes, and both sides really were kind of a problem at this point. On the Japanese side, it's not totally clear what happened. The traditional explanation is they decided to rearm their main battery with armor-piercing shells. And the story goes that when they were changing from the Sanshikiden shells to the armor-piercing shells, it was so chaotic that they had to stack the shells on the deck. And so they were in a very dangerous situation where if we had fired like one little 5-inch shell, we could have blown up both battleships because they had all these shells stacked up on the deck. There's reason to believe that didn't quite happen that way. For one thing, you really can't carry a 14-inch shell. It's very, very heavy. It may have been happening with the secondary armament where they were trying to get new ammunition in there from high explosive to armor piercing. But there may have been some chaos inside the magazines because their armor piercing and high explosive shells were probably in the bottom of it with the Sanshikiden shells near the top, and they were trying to get that rearranged. But there was a problem with rearming the battleships, with rearranging the armament, and that is why they did not open fire during that time. That was a reason why Admiral Abe, who was court-martialed for his performance here, they cited the rearming of the battleship shells as part of the reason for it. With the Americans, Admiral Callahan was having issues. He had chosen the San Francisco as his flagship, but the San Francisco did not have the most modern iteration of radar. By this point in the war, we had started having what was called the SG radar, which is the radar that's like a plot position indicator. And that was the new thing with the SG radar. That was the first type of radar that would show that type of picture. The previous iteration of radar was called SC. It looked nothing like what you see in radar today. What it sort of was, I'm oversimplifying this. If you've seen an EKG in a hospital, that's kind of what it looked like. But what it would show is sort of bounces on the screen at a particular distance from the ship, which was off on one side. And those balances had to be translated into a particular distance. And you had a secret code for that you had to keep on the side. And it was not easy to use. And Callahan did not have a lot of confidence in radar as a result. When battle came around, he could not get a picture in his mind of what the Japanese were doing. The cruiser Helena behind him had that new SG radar, and it was radioing into him what it was picking up and the distance and the bearing and where it could find out the course. And they would be plotted in a map on the flag bridge of the San Francisco. These were all different reports, and it was a static plot, and he could not figure in his mind what he was facing. So he kept delaying opening fire. He had this formation that was very symmetrical, but was not that good for this particular battle situation, partly because the ships had not worked together before. He had 4 destroyers in front. Then he had the Atlanta with Admiral Scott on board, and that was a problem in and of itself. San Francisco, Portland, Helena, Juneau, then the 4 destroyers and back. Normally, if you have 2 flag officers in a task force, you have them well separated so that if something happens to the one, the other one can take over. With this force, Admiral Scott and Admiral Callahan were right next to each other. So if the force got broken up, there was no admiral to take charge of it because they were all right next to each other. This was a bizarre arrangement for the force. The 2 anti-aircraft cruisers really should not have been there. They had no armor, and their guns would not really hurt the Japanese battleships, but they did have torpedoes, and that might have been the reason why Admiral Turner put them in there, although it went against what was the U.S. Navy's normal philosophy with gunfire. This was all one long column of ships, 4 destroyers in front, 5 cruisers in the middle, 4 destroyers in back. Once he got sort of a mass of Japanese on the screen, he had the column turn. He would place the entire column of ships perpendicular to the approaching Japanese. That was a formation known as crossing the T, because they would be the horizontal top on a Japanese vertical, and the horizontal top would be able to fire both their forward and after guns at the approaching Japanese, while the Japanese could only respond with their forward guns. That may have been what he was trying to do. That was standard practice in really all the navies at that time. The problem was he had turned too late. And while he had the ships turn, he still could not quite get in his mind what the Japanese were doing, what their formation was, where their ships were. And it ended up that his ships and the Japanese got intermixed. You had like a Japanese destroyer, the Udachi, crossed right in front of our U.S. destroyers, and we had to swerve to avoid hitting it, literally. But ultimately, that was a good thing, because remember what I said earlier about the San Francisco and the Portland with their 8-inch guns, they couldn't penetrate the Japanese armor on their battleships. And I said they could not normally penetrate the armor. They could if they were like right next to them, like maybe a couple 100 feet away, where they weren't firing indirect fire, but they were firing direct fire. And also the destroyers were close to the Japanese. And both of those would play a role in this battle to come, because the Japanese formation sliced through the U.S. formation just in front of the cruisers. And that is how they got so intermixed. One of the destroyers in the first 4 destroyers, the Laffey, was right in the battleship Hiei's line of movement. And they were on a collision course. And they were so close that the Laffey and the destroyers in front, their torpedoes would not arm, even assuming they would work. They would fire torpedoes at the Hiei, but that was Admiral Abe's flagship, Hiei. and they fired torpedoes, but they were too close, so the torpedoes could not arm. And so they just bounced off the battleship's sides. Meanwhile, the Hiei, she had turned on her searchlights so she could spot enemy ships, so she could shine them, pin them, and begin shooting at them. But when you use a searchlight, not only can you see the target in front of you, the target can see you too. And that's why the Hiei attracted so much fire, was because of those searchlights. But she kept moving on those destroyers in front, and the Laffey was the one that was directly in the line. They couldn't hit the Hiei with their torpedoes, but they were firing all of their machine guns, their 50 caliber machine guns, the pom-poms, and the 5-inch guns at the battleship's bridge. Ultimately, the Hiei ended up towering over the Laffey. The commander of the Laffey, a guy named Hank, he had to do some special things with the engines. He got the destroyer to lurch forward, and the Hiei's bow missed the destroyer by about 20 feet. But the Laffey's fire at the battleship's bridge, they made a difference. They made a serious difference, because Admiral Abe was not ready mentally for this battle. He had not wanted to fight it. And now you had these enemy ships that are way too close to the battleship. Normally, these ships would be further away. The battleship would make use of her range, of her guns. They wouldn't be up close. Normally, a battleship's bridge is not vulnerable to 5-inch shells from a destroyer, not vulnerable to machine guns from a destroyer. But the destroyers don't normally get that close. This time, they were. At least 3 5-inch shells from the Laffey struck the Hiei's bridge, and it shredded the bridge crew. Admiral Abe's chief of staff was killed. Abe was wounded in the head. That may have had a decisive impact on the battle, because it is now believed he had a concussion. He later said he didn't remember anything of the battle after this moment. As this continued, the destroyers continued to fire at the battleship. All the battleship had managed to do at the outset, and this is controversial, we had a couple friendly fire incidents during the campaign, but I believe that one of the battleship's first salvos struck the Atlanta and killed Admiral Scott. The battleship was firing with the Sanshikidan shells, the incendiary shells, and one struck just in front of the bridge where Admiral Scott was, and he was killed. At that point, the Atlanta got hit by several torpedoes. One broke her back, and she was lost without power. And so she just sort of drifted along. The San Francisco, with the Portland behind her, she was moving on a course parallel to the battleships. The Hiei had slowed down for some reason. At least that's what the witness accounts say. And the San Francisco kept firing her 8-inch guns at the battleship and not really hurting her, maybe taking a chunk out, but not really penetrating the battleship's hull armor except in one place. There was one shot from an 8-inch shell, ruptured a ventilation duct and sent water leaking into the steering compartment. And the seawater flooding the steering compartment, it shorted out the motor for the rudder. So the crew of the steering compartment had to hold the rudder in place while the ship steered with its engines. But remember what I said earlier about the 8-inch shells from the cruisers could not normally penetrate a battleship's armor. But this was an area where there would be the exception, because the cruiser was so close to the Hiei. The interesting thing to consider is whether Admiral Callahan intended that to happen. Because of all the screw-ups that we made setting up this task force, we ended up in the one situation that we could win.
Now, I did make a note of this. You know, how much of this is a win for the Americans? I guess it's a strategic win. They forced the Japanese to withdraw. What's the count on damaged shipping? If you're using that as another metric to gauge success.
Samuel Griffith, who was one of the Marines on Guadalcanal, he called this a Pyrrhic victory because said we couldn't afford another victory like this. We did win the battle strategically because after the bridge of the Hiei was hit, Admiral Abe ordered a withdrawal. But it was chaos. One survivor described it as like being in a bar fight with all the lights shot out. We were all intermingled like minnows in a bucket, is what Samuel Morrison said. I'd call it like Salamis, when all the ships were just completely intermingled. You didn't know which was which. But that was the only situation in which we could damage the battleships, was being so close to them. The question is whether Admiral Callahan intended that to happen or not. We'll never know, because he was killed at the battle as well. It was a broadside from the battleship Kirishima that smashed the bridge of the San Francisco. The San Francisco barely held together and killed Admiral Callahan, mortally wounded the skipper, Cassin Young. By the end of the night, we had sunk the Akatsuki and left the Udachi burning. The Japanese had withdrawn by that point, with the exception of the Hiei, and I'll get to that in a second. But when we pulled out, we left the Atlanta mortally wounded. We had the Juno, the other 5-inch cruiser. Her back was broken by a torpedo. The San Francisco was too heavily damaged to really do anything, but she was able to get out. The Portland was stuck in the Sound because she took a torpedo hit to the stern area that bent out part of her hull and turned into an impromptu rudder, so she kept going in circles. But her commander was still fighting, because he would still shoot his guns at any Japanese ship that appeared. He was a fighter. The Laffey was destroyed. The only destroyers we had left at the end were the O'Bannon, which had lost some of its gear and had to be sent forward to request aerial coverage. We were in very bad shape after the battle. We barely held together. Our ships were going back to Espiritu Santo, and the Japanese submarine I-26 was there, and she had already taken part of the scalp of the Saratoga, and she managed to put a torpedo into the Juno in a very tragic situation where the torpedo seems to have gone through the hole made by the first torpedo that hit the Juno and went straight to her magazines, and she blew up with, it was described as all the fury of an erupting volcano. She just disappeared. There were maybe about 100 survivors, but because of communications mishaps, no one was sent to rescue them for several days, and there were very few of them left. Getting back to the Hiei was still in Iron Bottom Sound. Her topsides were on fire. They had to evacuate the bridge. They had that hole in the hull near the stern area that was flooding the steering compartment. So Hiei could only steer by engine, by varying the speeds of her propellers. But because there was no one on the bridge, because it was on fire, that apparently became problematic, because the Hiei was going very, very slowly at this time. And she was sort of just crawling around directly around Savo Island. I don't know why she would do this. I don't know why she was going so slowly. They knew that air attacks would come with the morning, and yet she just seemed to be crawling around, not really going anywhere. They were fighting the fires on her main deck, but the steering compartment was still flooding. They eventually got the fires put out on the top deck. They got back to the bridge area, so they were able to give orders for where the ship was to go, but she was still crawling around. And ultimately, the men holding the steering gear, holding the rudder in place, had to leave, or else they would drown. They had to swim out of the compartment and go to the higher deck and leave the rudder unheld. The rudder swung to one side, to starboard, and stuck there. So the Hiei was left north of Savo Island, going in circles, circling to starboard. The Marines on Guadalcanal, they remembered the bombardment in the middle of October, and they were anxious to get a battleship under their belts. They wanted some vengeance for that bombardment, And here was the sister ship of the battleships that had done that, and she was crippled north of Savo Island. All she could do was steer in circles, and so they started launching a series of air attacks to try to put the battleship under.
See, what it's very reminiscent almost of is it the Bismarck? No, it's not the Bismarck. What's the other ship?
Well, so it was the Bismarck.
It's Bismarck, isn't it? They get stuck going in circles and takes pounding to try and sink the flipping thing.
The Hiei, and this was a pattern that would go on throughout the day. Henderson Field would send up Marine flyers, and then they would be joined by the pilots from the Enterprise, who sent her aircraft off to join the Marines at Henderson Field to try to sink the battleship and stop the convoy from coming in. We would launch an air attack on the Hiei. Our torpedoes would miss or would not explode. The bombs would hit but would not sink her. Once that was done, the battleship would stop. They would send divers over the side, and divers is a really grandiose term for just a bunch of guys in their underwear jumping overboard and holding their breath, and then they would stick towels or blankets into the hole to stop it from leaking. Then they would get back up and start pumping up the steering compartment, and then more American planes would come, so the battleship would have to get underway again. The American torpedoes would not explode, or they would miss. The bombs wouldn't hurt her too much, but then the plug would come out while she was moving. Then she'd have to stop, send more divers over, plug the hole back in again, start pumping the compartment out again, repeat ad infinitum. And that continued during the entire day with, it seems, Admiral Abe wanting to just scuttle the battleship, but she was not in danger of sinking. All she had was that hole in the steering compartment. That was the only flooding she had. Her engines were fine, and her guns were still functional. The only problem she had was in the steering compartment. She couldn't leave the area. She couldn't escape, and we couldn't sink her. So it was at a stalemate until very late in the day when some of the Enterprise flyers managed to perfectly execute one of the anvil attacks on the battleship and finally got some torpedoes in her.
Well, I was going to say, at this point, the Enterprise has arrived and they have been reinforced, haven't they? The U.S. Navy at Guadalcanal. This sets us up for the next night, round 2, isn't it?
Yeah, the Enterprise sent up a contingent to Henderson Field and then pulled back down to the south. She was not completely operational. We did not know at that point if the Enterprise was going to be able to help at all. It was originally projected that she'd be out for several weeks after Santa Cruz. Well, they got her up on the 13th, which was early. They still had workmen aboard her. She still could not use her forward elevator, and so her aircraft operations were slowed, and she was still trailing oil. But she was in the fight, and she had her battle-hardened flyers, and she had the battle-hardened flyers from the Hornet on her too. And so she catapulted a large contingent of them over to Henderson Field, kept enough fighters to defend herself, and hightailed it back to the south. It was the Enterprise's flyers that finally put the torpedoes in the Hiei that convinced the Japanese, or at least Admiral Abe, that she could not be saved. The Japanese ultimately, they left the battleship. They left the Hiei. They abandoned her and they just left her there. And so no one knows when she sank, but she sank sometime during the night. With the Imperial Japanese taking out the Hiei, it was the first battleship to be in that situation for them. It was an emotional issue for them, and she had also hosted the Emperor herself. And Admiral Yamamoto did not like the way Admiral Abe handled the battleship, and so he had Admiral Abe and Captain Nishida court-martialed. And they were both kicked out of the Navy, ultimately.
The Japanese fail again, don't they, this night of the 14th, 15th, to reinforce their troops on Guadalcanal. And I made a note that the Americans lose 18 ships in those few days, sunk and damaged. I mean, it's a big butcher's bill on the Americans' part, but they still deny the Japanese reinforcements to the Japanese army on the island, don't they?
Yeah. After the Friday the 13th action, as I call it, the Japanese were shocked by what happened and by their retreat, and so they ordered their transports back temporarily. the night after the Friday the 13th action, would be the 13th into the 14th, the Japanese sent a couple cruisers up to bombard Henderson Field and Fighter 1. The bombardment did very little. In fact, it seems to have missed the airfields altogether. So the next day was the big day because the transports were coming back down the slot under Admiral Tanaka's command. And he had foreboding about this whole thing. He did not like this operation. He did not like this idea of sending these transports down. He felt vulnerable. To try to cover it, the Japanese had set up what they called the Emergency Bombardment Unit. Now, I don't know if it's a unit for emergency bombardments or what an emergency bombardment is, or if it's an emergency unit that does bombardments. I'm not really clear on that. But at this point, they had 3 battleships in the area, the Kongo, Haruna, and Kirishima. And they only sent the Kirishima down. After taking several swipes at the retreating ships, the retreating cruisers from the bombardment the night before, we managed to sink one. Then we saw the transports coming in, and we knew that was the day that we had to stop the transports. Admiral Tanaka knew what was going to happen unless he got good air cover, and he did not get good air cover. They had 11 transports coming down. We sank 6 of them. A 7th was damaged so much it had to be taken back to short lands. Strangely enough, there weren't a lot of Japanese casualties, or I should say relatively few Japanese casualties from this, maybe about 400, 500, because all the soldiers on the ships, they were rescued, but the supplies were not. And that set up a situation on Guadalcanal. But by the end of the day, they had only 4 of their transports left with their escorts. And Tanaka was just frustrated at that point. I say we sank 6 of them. Ultimately, 6 of them sank, I should say, because some of them were left floating, but they were total losses. They couldn't move, and they would be finished off the next day. But by the end of that day, there were only 4 transports left operational, and Tanaka was taking them down. And they were to be covered by the bombardment, by the Emergency Bombardment Unit. It was personally handled by Admiral Kondo, commander of the 2nd Fleet. His flagship cruiser, Atago, that had always been his flagship. And at that point, we literally had no ships we could send up. The Japanese bombarded Henderson Field the previous night with cruisers because Admiral Halsey and Admiral Kincaid had another one of Admiral Halsey's famous miscommunications, and the battleships were not close enough to Guadalcanal to make it there that night. But with a battleship coming in on this particular night, we could and were able to send our battleships there. They were positioned south of Guadalcanal during the day, and then they made their move up there, the Washington and the South Dakota under Admiral Willis Augustus Lee, who was a radar expert. And that would be very, very useful in this battle. And the 4 destroyers that had the most fuel left, but who had never worked together. So they went up there to try to intercept the Emergency Bombardment Unit. And Admiral Kondo divided his forces 4 ways, and it became 5 ways, ultimately. He had the 2 cruisers and the battleship, and then he had 2 destroyer divisions, and those destroyer divisions set up screening units. And it was just one big, really weird web that didn't really accomplish anything. And the destroyers ended up basically colliding with each other. The 2 destroyer forces ended up getting so intermixed that they took themselves out of the battle later on. But Kondo knew that he was going to face opposition, but he thought they were going to be U.S. cruisers. And so he kept getting these reports, we're facing a battleship. These are really tall shell splashes. He did not believe that he was facing American battleships. And he kept getting the reports. And the American battleships, Admiral Lee, he had the 4 destroyers screening him. The Japanese ended up taking out the 4 destroyers, basically. Although we accidentally took out one of them in another friendly fire incident. We took out the Preston. What we called it later was we tripped the Japanese trap. I mean, we got them to spring the trap too soon.
Yeah.
They fired all their torpedoes from their destroyer divisions, who ended up colliding with each other and getting mixed up, so they couldn't help the cruisers and the battleship in the next phase. But for all of Admiral Lee's expertise in radar, the South Dakota, which was not his flagship, Washington was his flagship, but the South Dakota was dependent on radar as well. And she suffered an electrical breakdown that took out her radar. And so she felt blind. This newfangled object, this newfangled device that a lot of people didn't like, but on the battleships, they loved it. And without it, they felt blinded. They couldn't, it was dark. This was another night battle. They couldn't see where anyone was. They couldn't see where the Japanese were. And so they were blinded for like 3 minutes. And when the power came back on, the Japanese found her. They turned on their searchlights and they showed the spotlight on the South Dakota. And I call that the reckoning because these were new battleships. And Admiral Yamamoto's 6 months of running wild was over because this was where the Japanese were seeing American production begin to overtake them. And the Japanese, even with the Kirishima, they started just burying the South Dakota in 8-inch shells and 14-inch shells. The South Dakota was torn up above deck, losing like most of her radars, a lot of her communications. But aside from that one 14-inch shell that hit the barbette, she was never in any danger of sinking. And Admiral Lee had not been able to fire at the Japanese because I think he saw the accidental blasting of the Preston and was very concerned about friendly fire. And on his radar, on the Washington, he could not see the South Dakota because there was a blind spot right behind him. And the South Dakota was in that blind spot. As soon as he saw where the South Dakota was, which was when the Japanese were firing on her, he opened fire himself. And the Kirishima was just pounded. They kept going into the water just short of her, but then exploding right next to the hull or penetrating the hull below the water, almost like torpedoes, and exploding. And Kondo kept trying to take his cruisers, Atago and Takao, to try to take on the battleships, and he was not helped by an inept torpedo officer who could not figure out which way the Washington was going. And ultimately, the Kirishima just dropped back, and Kondo went on without her, and he sent the destroyers after the Washington, who was, by that point, she had stopped the bombardment of Henderson Field once again. She had delayed the transports long enough where the aircraft would take them after daybreak. So Admiral Lee decided to just pull out. And the Japanese destroyers chased her. Japanese destroyers chased a battleship. And they could chase a battleship because they had torpedoes. And they had very good torpedoes, and they had complete confidence in those torpedoes. And some of them got uncomfortably close to the Washington, exploding in her wake. But they did not get her at all. And the Kirishima started yet another emotional scene with the Japanese not wanting to give up on a battleship that was in deep trouble. Because she was a converted battle cruiser, she had some very open areas below decks. And so with the mining effect of the Washington shell, she had what was called the free surface effect. Basically, the water sloshing around inside her. And when the Kirishima would list to one side, they would flood the voids on the other side to try to bring her back to an even keel. Then she'd go listing to that side, and they'd flood the voids on the other side to try to bring her to an even keel. She kept just going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, until she was so waterlogged she could not move. Every time they would fill the void to try to bring her to an even keel to keep her from capsizing, they were actually putting another nail in her coffin. And like the Hiei, her steering room flooded, her rudder jammed, she could not move. They tried to have her towed by two destroyers. They couldn't get her to move. And this was pretty comical when she asked the cruiser Nagara and Admiral Kimura to tow her. The Nagara refused, and so her captain Iwabuchi, who ended up being a war criminal, he sent a message to Admiral Yamamoto. Admiral Yamamoto didn't make the Nagara tow the Kirishima, and so down she went, and she sank. And the next day, Admiral Tanaka, with his transports, with 4 of them left, he got the authorization to just run them aground. He figured that was the only way they could guarantee actually landing the troops and the supplies, because there were cranes on these ships and they could unload the stuff that way. So he ordered them to just run up onto the beach and unload troops. And so all the transports ultimately were lost that way. Henderson Field once again sent up the Marine and Navy flyers, and we just bombed the transports on the beach. And they would take, the Japanese were trying to unload the troops and build these supply caches on the beach, and we'd shoot up the supply caches. So ultimately the Japanese landed considerable numbers of troops, but almost no supplies. So you could argue that their position on Guadalcanal was even worse after this whole operation, or the naval battle of Guadalcanal, than it had been beforehand, because they actually had more troops on Guadalcanal, but not as much food to feed them, and no ammunition at that point.
This leads to sort of this desperation in sort of end of November, December into January, where it's almost diminishing returns for the Japanese as they desperately try to bring in more supplies for their troops there. I mean, but it's still up and down, isn't it? You know, the Minneapolis with Admiral Wright as its bow shot off, Admiral Griffin takes a pounding. But at what point do the Japanese finally say, you know what, I know it's up and down, but we're going to have to give up and withdraw?
Well, that's a pretty interesting point there, because they were starting to consider those diminishing returns in November. But we have that whole face thing, the concept of face, and admitting that they have lost on Guadalcanal would be a loss of face. And especially the Army cannot really deal with it. And so they tried increasingly desperate measures to supply the troops on Guadalcanal. At this point, they're just trying to get them food. They're really struggling to get them ammunition, but the real thing is food, because the troops are starting to starve. The Japanese ultimately called Guadalcanal Starvation Island. First, the Japanese tried bringing in supplies by submarine, which, if you think bringing in supplies by destroyer was inefficient, submarines are even worse, and they hated doing this. And they'd have to surface and set the supplies loose to go to shore. But we found out about these submarine supply runs, and we'd park a PT boat or a destroyer on top of them, and so the submarines couldn't do that, and so that didn't work. Then they tried another one called rat transportation. Ultimately, it was called rat transportation. The submarines were called mole transportation. The destroyers were called rat transportation. The Japanese had discovered that they could take a 55-gallon drum of oil and disinfect it, hopefully, and put food in it, seal it up, and they could drop it off and it would float. And so all you have to do is push all these drums overboard and they would float to shore and the Army could pick them up. And Admiral Tanaka was charged with taking his destroyers over to drop these supplies off of Guadalcanal. But we found out about it, and we sent Admiral Wright up with a whole bunch of cruisers and a whole bunch of destroyers to try to stop it. And this battle, it became known as the Battle of Tessa Faranga. This is something to remember, because this would be repeated up the Solomons. What happened was the Japanese were coming in. We found out about it. We sent our cruisers in. Admiral Tanaka had his destroyers launch torpedoes and then turn tail and run, and our cruisers blundered into the torpedoes. Repeat ad infinitum up the Solomons, because there's going to be a lot of this in the next book. Between the Minneapolis, the New Orleans, Pensacola, and the Northampton, they were all hit. The Minneapolis had her bow blown off in front of her number 1 turret. New Orleans had her bow blown off in front of her number 2 turret. And then the bow came and rammed the New Orleans. And so the New Orleans bragged that she was the only ship to have ever rammed herself. And the Northampton, she ultimately sank because of the torpedoes that went into her. And for Admiral Wright, he was a new commander. They had to get new commanders in here because Admiral Callahan and Scott were dead. Captain Hoover's career was ruined by Miles Browning. So they get new people in here, and before this battle, Admiral Kinkaid had developed a very good plan for this force to take on the Japanese. Admiral Wright had been involved in that plan, and so right before the battle, Admiral Kinkaid was transferred, naturally, and Admiral Wright took over and scrapped most of the plan. But he did what he was supposed to do. He did what his U.S. Navy training said. The problem was, at the beginning of the battle, he had his idea of the range to the Japanese ships, and the destroyers in front of him had a different idea of the range. They thought that they could launch torpedoes at the Japanese, which the original plan called for them to be able to fire without asking the admiral for permission. Admiral Wright changed it. But Admiral Wright on his ship, he didn't think the destroyers were in range to launch torpedoes. As best as I can tell, he spaced it and forgot the destroyers were way in front of him. That was it. That was really the difference in the battle. If they had launched torpedoes at that point, they may have caught the Japanese before anything bad had happened. But it was only like a few minutes, not even 5 minutes. But it was enough. The Japanese were presenting a bad torpedo solution after that, and that seems to have been the difference. That and radar, because this was another point of the war where we really didn't seem to grasp radar and its limitations. And there were a lot of things we didn't understand about radar. Our cruisers were firing so many shells at the Japanese at this point. And we saw what looked like all these hits. But at the early part of the battle, we were hitting nothing. We didn't start hitting the Japanese until one of their destroyers, the Takanami, started shooting at us and revealing her position in the night. Tanaka had said, don't use your guns, use your torpedoes. And this was another instance where American doctrine did not help us. The way we saw it, not only was gunfire superior to torpedoes, but, and this again would be an issue in the continuation of this campaign up the Solomons, we had this idea where we wanted to continuously fire. If we had 3 turrets of 3 guns apiece, we wanted at least one of those guns firing at all times. So you'd have multiple flashes going along the hull, the main deck at all times. The Japanese were different. What they did was they would have all of their guns fire at once and then do nothing while they were reloading. Fire all the guns at once, then nothing. So you got one big flash, and then it was all dark again. With us, you got a continual sighting of the gun flashes, which gave you an idea of the position of the ship. You don't always think of in those terms, but that was it's a subtle but an interesting difference that allowed the Japanese to pick up our ships much better than we were able to pick up theirs. But this battle of Faranga, this pattern would be played up the Solomon Islands. And it took us a long time to figure that out. It wasn't until late in 1943 they were actually able to figure out what they were doing and take some countermeasures against it. The Japanese did start to realize that not only was this dumping the oil drums off of the ship not effective, because maybe they got maybe 10% of the barrels to shore. And there was a big fight at Imperial General Headquarters, and it involved Masanobu Tsuji, and it involved lots of sake, and it involved what I call physical debate, like punching each other and drawing swords. And I am not making that up either. That actually happened at Imperial General Headquarters within the Army General Staff. And so the Japanese decided, because they can't retreat, because that would be a loss of face. So they would do what they called turn around and advance. They had this idea, turn around and advance. That's what they called it. When the orders came down and were taken to General Hyakutake, he wasn't sure his troops would obey it because they didn't want to retreat, because they would lose face. It was a loss of honor or something. So that is how they convinced the troops to leave. And by this time, they were starving. They were dropping every day. And this was how they realized they had to get out. They started making it look like they were going to reinforce the island. they're going to reinforce Guadalcanal by sending the destroyers down. But what they were really doing was sending the destroyers to pull the troops out.
Well, it's ironic that actually they can't get anything to the island, but the evacuation goes pretty well.
The evacuation goes almost perfectly. They lose one destroyer to probably a mine.
So, considering the Japanese evacuation goes well, it's 10 to 13,000 troops, Japanese troops are removed from Guadalcanal. How significant of a victory was it for the Americans?
It was a major strategic victory because we now had the Henderson Field on Guadalcanal to serve as a stepping stone to move up the Solomons. That was part of the weakness of the Japanese plan. Was they built this airfield up on Guadalcanal to start out with, but they couldn't support it. They needed to build an intervening airfield to cover the approaches to Guadalcanal from the northwest. Rabaul, Shortland, Boone. They needed to build something in the Central Solomons, and they discovered a place on New Georgia called Munda, and they started building an air base there at about December 1942, January 1943. But they needed to do that at about the time, or even a little before, they started building the airfield on Guadalcanal. It was because Guadalcanal was so far away from the airfields in Rabaul and even the airfields at Boone that the Japanese lost so many aircraft trying to attack Henderson Field because they were fighting on the Allies' turf. It was such a long way to Guadalcanal. It was such a long way back. If they were shot down over Guadalcanal, the pilots were probably not going to find a way back if they survived the crash at all. And if they crashed on the way back, well, they were more likely to crash on the way back because of the distance. We had the home field advantage when the Japanese attacked Guadalcanal. We had the home field advantage because if our aircraft were shot down, if the pilot could get out of the aircraft, okay, he would probably return to duty again fairly quickly. And that certainly happened a time or two with Joe Foss, the famous Marine fighter pilot, who later became governor and became commissioner of the AFL, American Football League. But from the Japanese standpoint, the reason they lost so many pilots in the Guadalcanal campaign and so many ships was because Guadalcanal was so far away. They did not have the intervening airfield, and Munda came online too late. And by the time it came online, it could not be a main airfield because we kept attacking it every night and every day somehow, and so they couldn't base aircraft there. It was more of an emergency airfield. But with us, now we had Guadalcanal, and we could step up the Solomons and not make the same mistakes the Japanese did in jumping too far. Instead, we would make all new mistakes. We would make new mistakes. We would make mistakes that we should have learned from during the Guadalcanal campaign and didn't. It was always intended to be a stepping stone, as Admiral King called it, to hop up the islands of the Solomons all the way to Rabaul. And so this was a major strategic victory for the Allies. It prevented the Japanese from cutting off Australia. It took territory that had been Japanese and made it Allied once again. And that was a first. Although the timing and the location of it were selected by the Japanese, in effect, we would choose when and where to strike next, and that would be at first the Russell Islands and at New Georgia. The Japanese were fighting two battles at this point, not just Guadalcanal, but remember New Guinea. New Guinea was a big factor for the Japanese as well, and the Army and the Navy at Imperial General Headquarters kept going back and forth on which was more important, New Guinea or the Solomons. And it seemed to be that whichever one branch wanted, the other branch wanted the other one. If the Army thought New Guinea was more important, the Navy would think the Solomons were more important. Then the Navy changed and thought New Guinea was more important, and then the Army thought the Solomons were more important. And they kept going back and forth on this. And we would see some of the results of that with the Battle of the Bismarck Sea, which was another sea change like Guadalcanal was in the Pacific War.
Well, Jeff, that seems like a good place to finish for now. I look forward to the third book in the trilogy. Loyal listener, if you want to read more about the Guadalcanal-Solomons campaign, Jeff's first book is Morning Star Rising Sun, and that's followed by Blazing Star Setting Sun. Don't forget, if you enjoy the podcast, you can sign up to be a patron at patreon.com/WW2podcast. We're in Northwest Europe in the next episode, looking at the last battle of the war in Europe, where the fighting actually finished days after the German surrender had been declared. So until then, I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.